Hello everyone, my name's Tessa Kegel and I'm the coordinator of HBS 5 OHA. I look forward to meeting you in Collaborate sessions. This is Module 1, Part 1, and today I'm just going to present an overview of occupational health and safety. This is the Copyright Warning Act, which covers a series of lectures. So in this module, you'll explore definitions of occupational health and safety and read about the historical development of occupational health and safety. The concepts of occupational health hazards and risks will be introduced with an overview of how hazards and risks are prevented. An introduction to the provision of occupational health services will then be covered. So on successful completion of this module, you should be able to define occupational health and safety, briefly describe the historical development and underpinnings of OHS, analyse and communicate the concepts of hazard and risk and the principles of prevention, assessment and control of risk in the workplace, describe the practical implementation of occupational health and safety services within industry. So we'll start off with a few definitions. First of all, from the ILO, that's the International Labour Organization, in conjunction with the WHO, and this is all from 1950, so a number of years ago now. So in 1950, the International Labour Organization described occupational health in terms of physical, mental and social well-being. So I guess I just want to stress that the concept of looking at occupational health in terms of both mental and social well-being, as well as physical well-being, isn't a new concept. So no matter what some people may think, looking at mental and social well-being has been around for a number of years now. So the promotion and maintenance of the highest degree of physical, mental and social well-being of workers in all occupations. The prevention amongst workers of departures from health caused by their working conditions. So it's really looking at the effects of working conditions on workers' health. The protections of workers in their employment from risks resulting from factors adverse to health, the placing and maintenance of the worker in an occupational environment adapted to his psychological equipment. So really it's about looking at the mental health aspects of work as well as the physical aspects. And then to summarise, the adaptation of work to man and each man to his job. Or of course, as we'd say now, for each man and woman to his job. So it's really about trying to fit the work to the person and fitting the people to their work. So the main focus in this joint ILO-WHO definition is really on three different objectives. So first of all, the maintenance and promotion of workers' health and working capacity. And again, I would draw people's attention to the notion of promotion, so health promotion in the workplace. The improvement of the working environment and work to become conducive to safety and health. And finally, for the development of work organisations and working cultures in a direction which supports health and safety at work, and in doing so also promotes a positive social climate and smooth operation and may enhance productivity of the undertakings. So I guess what I want to draw your attention to with this is that even back in 1950, there was the notion that paying attention to occupational health, providing health promotion, providing a safe working environment would probably enhance the productivity of the business. So in the final part of this definition, there's mention of a working culture which supports health and safety and a positive social climate. So these are all things that the occupational health and safety framework, the legislative framework, is pointing us towards in the current day. So going on now to another definition of occupational health and safety. So this is from French in 1973. So he defines occupational health as the creation of a state of physical and mental well-being within the occupational environment, whilst taking into consideration factors related to the social and domestic life of each individual. Now, this is really important because it tries to consider the importance of factors outside the workplace, so the social and domestic life of each individual and how this might affect what happens in the workplace, but also how the workplace might affect the social and domestic life of workers. And this is an important concept that we'll be returning to as the course progresses. And then we go on to occupational safety. And this is again from the joint ILO WHO definition. So safety can be somewhat difficult to define, and it's often not well defined, but it's assumed to be understood. Now, safety can be said to be the part of occupational health, or perhaps the part of occupational health which is specific to prevention and protection, rather than thinking about health in terms of health promotion. So the joint ILO-WHO Committee on Occupational Health defined safety as the condition in which people are protected from the risk of work injury so far as is reasonable in the light of current knowledge through control of the working environment, work methods, machinery, plant, equipment, and human factors conducive to accidents and injuries. So it's really trying to promote a systematic approach to prevention of risk. So trying to look at the whole system in terms of how safety might best be promoted within the workplace. And again, these are concepts that are promoted that can be found in current legislation, and we'll be turning to these concepts over and over again through the course of OHA. So now we're going to change track a little bit and look at some of the historical patterns of work and occupational health and safety from pre-industrial times. Now, first of all, we're going right back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. And for the ancient Greeks and Romans, work was an activity which was really only for slaves. So slaves could be bartered or sold for goods, and they were compelled to work by law and punished if they did not work. They earned no pay. Some slaves were skilled in trades or teaching, and others were craftsmen or women. Hazards such as dusts from mining were known at these times, but slaves' health was not considered to be of particular importance because there was an abundance of cheap slave labour available. However, in saying this, it also needs to be recognised that the hazards of certain types of work were already recognised back in these times. So there are records of workers, or I should say slaves, being given pigskin masks if they're engaged in asbestos mining, for example. However, as I said, slave labour was considered to be cheap and disposable. So during the ages in Central Europe, the status of mining changed from a feudal enterprise to a skilled occupation. As the demand for gold and silver currency increased, mines got deeper and conditions worsened. Agricola, who was active between 1494 and 1555, wrote in De Re Metallica about the afflictions of miners, including probably the first description of radiation-induced lung cancer associated with exposure to silicous rock. Paracelsus, who was active between 1493 and 1541, wrote a monograph on diseases of mining and smelting, and was the first person to point out that occupational diseases were a necessary and concomitant result of industrial development. So then we move on to Ramazzini. Bernardino Ramazzini, who is considered to be the father of occupational medicine. So he wrote a systematic study of work-related diseases from Renaissance Italy in his volume, which was entitled De Morbis Artificicum Diatriba, and excuse my pronunciation. Now, real importance, in this volume he asked physicians to venture one more question: what occupation does he follow? So he was the first recorded physician to ask people what they do in terms of their living. So what type of work were they engaged in? Now, his book is really interesting, and there's certainly facsimile version available, which we would urge you to just have a look at, have a flick through. So a number of the conditions that he recognised are still of relevance today, including, really interestingly, he speaks about diseases of scribes and notaries, and where he describes occupational overuse or MSD disorders. So now we're moving on to the Industrial Revolution. And most of our focus really is on England because that's where most of our Australian legislation, occupational health and safety legislation, originates. So in England in the 18th century, there was a time of great industrialisation, and people moved from the country to towns to work in the new factories. Housing was generally really poor, and there was very poor sanitation, or no sanitation. Malnutrition, overcrowding, poverty and unemployment were caused by fluctuations in the economy. However, workers were grouped into identifiable work roles, and therefore it became possible to collect information on workers and the effects of work. Workers at all levels were exposed to the pressure of increasing production and the associated physical and psychosocial hazards of work. So this then becomes where we see the first health effects of mechanisation. As manufacturing techniques improved, machines became faster and more dangerous. Little attention was given to safety devices, and workers were often not trained to handle the new machinery. Workers were subjected to prolonged exposure to a wide range of newly introduced chemicals without considering the possible effects on workers. Manufacturers believed it was economically important to keep machines running continuously with cheap labour. In the factory, workers could no longer work according to the rule of their strength and convenience, but became exposed to the pressure of continuous work at a speed imposed by the needs of production, a continuing pressure which dominates society today. With this increasing mechanisation, increasing workplace accidents, worsening of conditions for workers, there began to be a move and a desire to intervene in the workplace and to put some sort of controls in place around these really horrific occupational health and safety standards. So we begin to see the beginnings of OHS interventions. So in 1802, Sir Robert Peel, a mill owner, introduced into the British House of Commons the first factory bill, which became famous as the Health and Morals of Apprentices Act of 1802. It limited the hours of work for apprentices to 12 hours per day to allow time to attend church and secular education, and it also introduced a requirement for ventilation and whitewashing of workrooms, although by today's standards this was fairly inadequate. I think it was once per year or something. Government interference in occupational health matters was established by this, and the Act culminated in the 10-Hour Act of 1847, which allowed women and young workers a 58-hour work, which was an enormous improvement on the previous work standards, or lack of work standards, perhaps we should say. The 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, Anthony Ashley Cooper, spent most of his life trying to relieve the conditions of the destitute and the deprived.
As a Member of Parliament, he promoted legislation to reduce hours and improve conditions of work for women and young persons employed in mines, factories and other workplaces. He did much to relieve oppressive conditions created by the Industrial Revolution in Britain. During both the 18th and 19th centuries, facts about the ill effects of work on health emerged from the observations of a handful of physicians who took an active interest in the diseases of occupations. For example, in 1775, Percival Pott identified soot as a cause of scrotal cancer in child chimney sweeps. Charles Turner Thackeray, a physician from Leeds, published the first work in English on occupational diseases, and he's been regarded as one of the great pioneers in occupational medicine. I draw your attention to the quote on the slide. So many persons who reflect on the subject will be inclined to admit that our employments are in a considerable degree injurious to health, but they believe, or they profess to believe, that the evils cannot be counteracted, and urge that an investigation of such evils can only produce pain and discontent. From a reference to fact and observations, I reply that in many of our occupations the injurious agents might be immediately removed or diminished. Evils are suffered to exist, even when the means of correction are known and easily applied. Thoughtlessness or apathy is the only obstacle to success. So this quote is really important because what he's starting to talk about here is the notion of controls to hazard, mitigation of risk. And so the other diagram that we have on the slide there, the one with all the funky creatures in the drop of water, that's supposed to represent what was currently in Thames water. Another slide for your amusement. In 1832, Michael Sadler introduced a new bill to Parliament, the Factory Act of 1833, well, 1833 by the time it was passed. This act created a factory inspectorate and required that medical practitioners certify only children who seemed by their strength and appearance to be at least 9 years old, the youngest age for which employment was allowed in textile mills. So we have now that children only over the age of 9 were allowed to work legally, and their work was restricted to 58 hours per week. By 1855, the new Factory Act gave physicians new duties, which were to certify that young persons were not incapacitated for work by disease or bodily infirmity, and to investigate industrial accidents. By the 1860s, factory inspectors were given legal powers to enforce occupiers of factories to control dust by fans or other mechanical means. So what we have here is both a medical and a legal obligation, medical and legal enforcement of occupational health and safety. So you can see that a range of different impetus were sort of trying to drive this change in terms of occupational health and safety. And again, at around this time, census data begins to be used to record deaths in specific occupations, to calculate mortality rates, and this draws attention to the gross risk of injury and disease in factory workers and miners. Now on this slide, there's a few pictures of work that was undertaken by children. As you can see, children were very valuable workers because they could fit into very small spaces, as is really graphically illustrated by the picture of the child miner. So Shepherd, who was an occupational historian, in 1901 he wrote about the voluntary efforts to improve working conditions in Victorian England, which began with a group of Quaker, cocoa and chocolate manufacturers, so Cadbury, Fry and Rowntree. So these men, partly because of their religious convictions, but also partly because they recognised that it made good sense, good business sense, made sure that their employees were well housed, healthy and fit. They provided their workers with good housing, playing fields and parks, and improved working conditions, and provide private social security systems. Now, some of these villages are actually still around today, and you can go and have a look at what was provided to workers at the time. And even though they might seem really primitive by our standards, they were still a great deal better than what was in place generally, or what was previously in place. Now, also around this time in North America, the Kellogg family, who were inspired by the Seventh-day Adventist, so the Seventh-day Adventist family, took similar steps in terms of providing good housing, looking after the general health and well-being of their workers. Now, also around this time in Germany, there was legislation which was passed which led to the first German compensation law, the Imperial German Accident Insurance Law, which was passed in 1885. And eventually, this led to workers' compensation insurance being spread across Europe. Towards the end of the 19th century in the UK, workers in dangerous trades were required to be examined periodically by the certifying surgeons. The principle of notification of diseases was introduced in 1895 to obtain knowledge of important diseases such as lead, phosphorus, and arsenic poisoning. The physicians were also given powers to suspend sufferers from work. So this is really important. This is the first evidence, or the first legislative evidence, that people will put off work if they had been injured or become ill because of their work. The first real impetus for the voluntary appointment of doctors by employers came after the passing of the first Workers' Compensation Act in the UK in 1897. So now we're moving towards the 20th century, and we come across one of my personal heroes, Alice Hamilton. So in the USA, Alice Hamilton spent 40 years of her life investigating occupational hazards, starting in 1910. She surveyed poisoning in the lead industries and fought opposition from her colleagues and her employers. Her investigations included silicosis in the Arizona copper mines, carbon disulfide poisoning in the viscose rayon industry, and mercury poisoning in the quicksilver mines of California. Now, this is really extraordinary that a woman was involved in this work at the time. And there's a quote from Alice Hamilton at the top of that slide there. So it was also my experience at Hull House that aroused my interest in industrial diseases. Living in a working class quarter, coming into contact with labourers and their wives, I could not fail to hear tales of danger that working men faced, of cases of carbon monoxide gassing in the great steel mills, of painters disabled by palsy, of pneumonia and rheumatism among the men in the stockyards. So then we move on to World War I. And during World War I, the shortage of munitions was not solved by workers having to work longer hours. So there was a real shortage of munitions, but they found that workers working longer hours didn't mean that they were more productive. Surprise, surprise. This stimulated scientific inquiry into the broader effects of work on health and efficiency. And there was a rapid growth in first aid and in industrial, medical and nursing services. After World War II, standards of occupational health and safety services were raised by the increasing number of professionally trained health workers, advances in techniques for health and environmental monitoring, and improved methods of collecting and distributing knowledge about work hazards and their control through national and international agencies. And we've already seen the ILO, WHO, a number of these organisations really being founded and starting to influence what was going on in terms of occupational health and safety. So now we bring to a close the final part of this first part of the lecture by looking at what was happening in the Australian context. So in Australia, the first occupational health nurse was appointed in 1911 for T&G Mutual Life. And this was followed by occupational health nurses employed by some of the retail stores such as Myers and David Jones, again trying to follow that role of the benevolent employer looking after their workers because of it as a moral imperative, but also in terms of economic business sense. Now, in Australia, it wasn't actually until 1969 that the Australian Society of Occupational Medicine was found, and not until 1983 that the Australian College of Occupational Medicine was founded. And so from then onwards, we get postgraduate courses in occupational medicine being taught at various colleges and so on. So this ends this part of the lecture. Please come back and listen to part 2 of this lecture.